got a really great question after adult Sunday school this week. So it's not really the longer ending as it pertains to Revelation 4 and 5. It's the longer ending as it pertains to Revelation chapter 2, 1 through 7. So we've pulled the address to the seven churches out of the morning sermon series. We're going to take each one of those seven churches in adult Sunday school portions after the service. And after looking into the address to the church in Ephesus, I got a great question. The question was, what are marks, or how was it phrased? What is a culture or an environment for graceful rebuke? What does that look like? What does graceful rebuke look like? What is that kind of environment? What a church that can do graceful rebuke, what do they have? Because that's what we want. So that's kind of the issue with the church in Ephesus. We see it in Acts. We see it in letters to Timothy, who was a bishop in Ephesus. We see it in Revelation 2, 1 through 7. We see it in Ignatius's address to the Ephesians, that there's this problem of false teaching. Okay, you guys got to be really careful about false teaching. Well, they're commended for this in the address in Revelation chapter 2. You've done a great job in staving off false teachings, all kinds of false teachings. Maybe it was the worship of the Greek god of wilderness, Artemis, large temple in Ephesus. Maybe it was Caesar worship. Maybe it was the Nicolaitans. They were kind of antinomians that said, doesn't matter what you do with your body. Do whatever you want with your body. There's grace. So don't worry about being lawful or moral. So all these kind of heresies. In Acts, Paul tells the Ephesian elders that they're wolves that are coming in. He names some names in 1st and 2nd Timothy. But you can imagine, and this is kind of the thinking we did in adult Sunday school. You can imagine the attitude in that kind of church that's just hyper focused on orthodoxy above all else, and you end up with this environment. And maybe some of you come from places like this, and I know that in my CRC circles, our church too, we have a proclivity of this kind of attitude. So it's really familiar. I think, at least in the circles that I run in, this attitude of mistrust, right? Because even saying something the wrong way, even if you had the right intent, even if you said it wrong, we need a clarification, and everyone's gonna call you out. Well, it comes as no surprise then that the rebuke to the church in Ephesus in Revelation is, you've forgotten to love one another. And you've got all kind of scriptural passages. Love covers a multitude of sins. If you speak with all wisdom but have not love, you're a resounding gong. And so we get this question: well, how do you have both? How do you have love and orthodoxy together? Or graceful rebuke was the way the question was phrased. Great question. And these are the kind of questions that are tough. These are the kind of questions you get on the floor of classes when you take your commissioned pastor exam, right? And it's so situational that it's tough to answer the question. Well, what I would do in one scenario is very different than what I would do in another scenario, because it's dependent on a whole bunch of factors. How well do I know this person? What is it that's being rebuked? Is it that someone who offered a prayer at some point in our liturgy said something that was, that probably wasn't correct? Well, that gets rebuked one way, and infidelity in a marriage gets rebuked a totally different way, and drunkenness gets rebuked a whole other way. And so there's all scenarios and what role they are in and what our expectations of them are, right? There's all kinds of things that come into play. But I guess the question was more getting at the environment. Like what's a church look like that has both of those things? a firm grasp on orthodoxy, but also a real graciousness. I just thought of three things. One was love, and I kind of got at some of those passages. 1 Corinthians 13, from I think it's First or Second Peter maybe. Love covers a multitude of sins. You have to love one another. Two, you have to have biblical process to do graceful rebuke. Biblical process. Matthew 18 stuff. Process. Okay? God put processes in place, hierarchies in place, so you could go about rebuke the right way. Attending a church that has elders and deacons as prescribed by the New Testament, so that there is a correct process. How do we deal with someone who needs a rebuke? Well, the first thing you do is not announce it from the pulpit. It might need to be announced from the pulpit down the line, but the first thing you do is you go to your brother, right, and offer a rebuke in person. The next thing you do is you bring a friend and you offer a rebuke in a small group. The next thing you do is you bring it to attention to the elders and deacons of a church, and they deal with it, I would say, at first as privately as possible, and finally, way down the line, there may be some announcement, right? So there's a process, there's attention to detail that helps us to do that kind of thing gracefully. And that biblical process takes two to tango, kind of. So there's always two parties in rebuke, right? There's we'll just call him sinner, okay? The person who's in need of rebuke, and the rebuker, the one who's administering the rebuke. So there's a sinner and a rebuker. Now, if it's done lovingly, in grace, love does not anger, right? So if the person who's administering the rebuke, the rebuker, can do it without being angry, and the one who's receiving the rebuke can do it without getting angry, right? That allows us to move through this biblical process. In my experience, that's rarely the case. Sometimes people rebuke in anger, and that's not loving, grace-filled rebuke. Oftentimes, also, the person receiving the rebuke receives it in anger, and you can present it with all manner of love and grace, and if it's received in anger, you're going to have a tough time working your way through the biblical process of graceful rebuke. Okay, so have to have love, have to have biblical process. You absolutely have to have the Holy Spirit. You can't have graceful rebuke without the Holy Spirit. The Spirit is the bond of peace. And this is why the rebuke is so serious to the church in Ephesus in Revelation. Like, he says, I will snuff out this lamp, right? You will no longer be a church if you can't figure out how to love one another. Why is that? Why is our love for one another so important? Well, if you can't demonstrate that there's a bond of peace among the brothers, you don't have the Spirit, right? Then you're not a Christian church if you don't have the Spirit of God. So you have to have the Spirit. So I said 3, but maybe I'll make it 4, because I think there's another thing. So you have to have love, have to have biblical process, have to have the Spirit. And it really helps if you know your doctrine. If you know your doctrine. One, it helps you to guard the orthodoxy, to do the rebuking where it needs to be done. But it also helps you to be open-handed, where you can acknowledge, look, I know my stuff, and there's real mystery here, and so we can be more open-handed. Or I know my stuff, and there's no mystery here. There's an A and a B, right? It's black and white. We can deal with it. So knowing your doctrine allows you to both deal with things very closed-handed in a very closed-handed way and a very open-handed way.